Welcome to the third episode of the Social Exchange. I'm your host, Mary Blackburn, and today I have a very special guest for our introduction, DJ Lucas. He is talented, smart, funny, and oh so handsome. He is the editor and producer of the Social Exchange, and he is my partner in every way. I'm so happy to have you here today, DJ.
Hello.
Now, one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on this introduction is because we are actually going to be talking about immigration, both the process of immigration in America and also hear more about the side of immigrant stories and where they're coming from, and really diving into how complicated and how heartbreaking a lot of their situations are,
Right.
and kind of learn a little bit of how to remain educated and help in the situation. We got to sit down and talk to Professor Marquez, and I am full of so much gratitude that she took aside time to meet with us and educate us, and she was really informative, but also she was realistic, but not pessimistic. And I think that's really hard in all this, is to remain optimistic through so many of the recent events. So how are you feeling about this? I know we've talked about it a lot, but I wanted to bring you on because I know it's something that's very important to both of us.
Right. Yeah. Well, absolutely. It's definitely like, I feel like it came as a surprise to everyone that didn't know about it, like in the masses when it came out. And everyone's just kind of like trying to process that information the best they can. It's, a lot of people have a lot of different feelings on it. But I think the important thing to think about is like, don't lose sight that these are real people that are being affected by this. And like, just try to put yourself in their shoes. Like, if I was this person, how would I want people treating me? And like, not to like automatically label them as something. It's like, oh, they're a criminal, which like that's not the case. Not everyone that comes to America from Mexico is a criminal that crosses the border legally. There are a myriad of reasons why people do what they do, to try to provide better for their families and, other reasons like that. So I feel it's really important in this time where everyone's kind of like going back and forth on like different facts and statistics and things like that, to really just consider like the human element of it, and just like, don't forget that these people that you're talking about online are people too.
Right. And I think, you were talking about labeling, and so much of the rhetoric that is surrounding this, a lot of the recent events with immigrations and just throughout our history has been building, because there's just been a continuous mindset that kind of feels like a poison that just is perpetuating these ideas that are just, when you look at it and you educate yourself, it just doesn't feel like it holds any truth to it.
Right.
And I think one thing that I feel about sociology is a lot of the time people think we make up we don't make up, but we find these statistics, whether that's for immigration or social deviance or different ethnicities or sexual orientation. We study all of these things. We study all of these big groups, and we do study stereotypes. We look at why they've come to be, and sometimes they're not always bad, but we also look at how does this affect that group? How does this labeling happen? What does that mean? What is the self-fulfilling prophecy of this? Which of course just means that this person, you tell someone something enough, they will become that a lot of the time. And so I think what's so important with sociology is that there are always outliers, and ultimately, no matter what you're studying, these are people, these are individuals, and it's important that even if you're a filmmaker or you're a sociologist or you're a reporter or you're just someone that wants to help, not to forget that, and learn how to help. And I think we really got to learn so much in this interview today, and I hope that the listeners feel that way. And without further ado, I guess you guys should go ahead and listen to the interview.
enjoy.
Welcome to the third episode of the Social Exchange. I'm sitting here with Professor Marquez. And first off, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. We are going to be talking about immigration in America. That is a very hot topic right now. And I think that it really needs to continue on being discussed. And I think a lot of the sociological side of it is not being discussed as much. It's so political that I really wanted to take a look at what is the sociology side of it. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, would you mind introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about what you do specifically?
Yeah, sure. So I am a PhD in sociology, and I do specifically work in Latin America and Mexico. And so my recent research is on immigration detention, and so we got a bunch of contracts from the government, from the Bush administration to the Obama administration, and how immigration detention was being run at the time. And so at that time, we see that there's people dying, we see that there's deficiencies, so that means that the policies that ICE says that they follow, they don't actually follow. And so part of my future research is looking at how these immigration detention centers serve deportation, right? Mm-hmm. So what is effective about these specific institutions, and what needs to change? And a lot needs to change. Even in the Obama administration, we know that a lot of people were being deported, and now that Trump's executive orders have changed the way that people are specifically prioritized to be deported, has kind of created an influx of priority deportations. So mainly my work is, one, to kind of call out the deficiencies, because a lot of this stuff wasn't being researched at all. Mm-hmm. Secondly, what is best for immigrants who are undocumented in this country? Mm-hmm. And thirdly, to make sure that we tell the story of the people who are going into these deportation centers.
Yeah, that's that must be very complicated, because I feel when we are researching those just publicly, a lot of the time it feels like we're getting such mixed signals, and it's really hard to find like what is actually happening. And so much of the time we're looking at the American side of it and how it's going to affect us and how it's going to help or hurt us. So with that, just because I think a lot of the conversation is with what immigrants do to our economy. And a lot of the time, I think that there's a false belief that they drain our economy and that they're going to hurt us economically. So would you be able to break down what are the positive and negative effects that immigrants have on our economy in America?
Right. So a lot of undocumented workers specifically work in lower sector jobs, right? So California is actually the largest producer of our vegetables and fruits in this country, right? And they also hire the most undocumented workers, right? And so all of this means that when you're undocumented, that you're not really covered by all the like worker rights that we see plastered on the wall. So they work long hours, right? But the positive aspects is that they contribute enormously to the economy.
Yeah, I think I read that it was something like $10 billion, and that is mm-hmm. with a B, to our economy. And I think a lot of the time people kind of act like that's not what they're doing, that they're not adding to our economy, that they're taking mm-hmm. our jobs. But as you just said, a lot of the time their rights are not what we as workers have in America. And a lot of the time they're doing the jobs we don't want to do. They're doing the hours that we don't have to do because we have all of these workers' rights backing us up. Mm-hmm. So with that, because I know that was a question kind of for America's side of it, but I just kind of wanted to start it with that to kind of get an idea about how much they really are helping in a lot of ways. So why are the reasons that people are coming to America?
Right. So A fun fact about me, I actually was undocumented at one point in my life. And so one of the reasons why my parents came is because they were living in extreme poverty in a suburb. It's not really a suburb. That's the nicer area. It was a poor area of Mexico City called Nezahualcóyotl, and in that area there's a lot of violence, a lot of not even like gang affiliated. There's just people are poor, right? There's garbage in the street. Actually, the place where my parents' home was next to like the city dump, so. They wanted me to have a future, and so that's the same narrative that you hear with people coming in. And so Mexicans, Guatemalans, Salvadorians, like all of Central America are having to deal with, one, poverty. The poverty is real. And so we don't really see that in rural areas of the United States, but they do exist, extreme poverty. So when you're in your small town or your small city, you don't necessarily get confronted with poverty, the visuals of poverty, right? And so a lot of the times in the United States, you're guaranteed an education, right? Like it doesn't matter if you're undocumented, if you're a person of color, right? All of these things have been ruled by our Supreme Court that you have access to education. Places like Mexico, if your kid doesn't go to school, yes, you get like the equivalent of CPS, but there's no real follow-up, right? And we know that in the United States, there is issues with police, right? We definitely know this, but in Mexico, it's even worse, right? That the police are actually being paid by, narcos or people who are in the drug cartel, and people are scared to leave their house, right? And so when I was working in Mexico on my dissertation, there was actually a whole little town being kind of taken over by drug cartels, right? And so what do you do when your country is being kind of taken over a little bit? And the other work that I've done, people have asked, this is my situation, what do I do? And a lot of them have to do with threats of kidnapping, right? That their kids are being kidnapped or being threatened to kidnap. And so that's why they bring them over. And that was actually the case for one of my family members. He was being threatened to be kidnapped at like the age of 19. And so my grandpa was like, bring him over because we don't want him to die, right? So those are the realities, right? That people can't have education and housing, right? So in Mexico, it's kind of customary that like 3 families will live in a really small house, right? My dad was one of 9, and he specifically lived in one room, I think about maybe a little bit bigger than this size.
Wow.
And so you need a place to live, right? You need food, you need the ability to work. And that's why people who come here end up working long hours in order to make sure that they can come and live, right? But in addition to like wanting the American dream, quote unquote, they also come with a lot of debt because it's not necessarily simple to come to the United States.
Yeah. And that actually leads into my next question. What is the process of acquiring a visa and getting into this country? Because I think a lot of the conversation right now, I feel like people are, when we do talk about illegal immigrants, we're like, they just need to come into this country legally. And it's like, I'm pretty sure they would do that if it was simple. But then I've also heard stories of people taking 20, 30 years to get a visa. And so what is that process? Because it doesn't feel that it's as efficient as I think the American people perceive it to be.
Yeah. So there is a process, right? But that process requires you to prove that you have money. So it's kind of interesting that the visa system in Mexico is it's guaranteed if you're rich. It's not so much if you're poor, right?
Which is the opposite of what these people need. Right.
So if you want a work visa, you have to prove that you have work in Mexico. You don't have work in Mexico because you work in like the underground market, right? You don't have proof, like tax forms, all that stuff. again, then you have to wait the process. You've already invested lots of money. Most of the time, that money is being funded by people who are working in the United States, actually. They denied my grandma a visiting visa because they were scared that she was going to work in the United States. My grandmother is 70 and can't walk. She doesn't need to be rejected just for being threatened to work.
Wow.
Right?
Okay.
And so there's also processes where sometimes different sites make it easier. So different cities in Mexico make it easier to get a visa, so people strategize. So if you go to like Tijuana or even like Ciudad Juarez in the border, those are a little bit easier than going to like even Mexico City and the embassy specifically. They also are very discriminatory against indigenous people in Mexico. We can't excuse just America for having its racism problems. Mexico and the rest of Central America are very racist as well. So they tend to not consider people who are indigenous because they're like, oh, they're just gonna come. And the process of getting a visa or even residency is so long, right? It takes about an average of 10 years, right, just to have a permanent residency in the United States. If you overstay your visa, you've now put yourself in a gray area. Even to like get documents in this country, you have to kind of like apologize to America. Well, that's what happened in the 90s.
In what way?
So you have to write a letter that you're like sorry that you crossed. That was what my dad had to do.
You have to write a sincere apology letter?
Yes. And so there was a whole like medical examinations. I was young, so I don't really remember specifics, but I had to be answered all these questions about like, do you have AIDS? At 7, I didn't know what that was. So I was like, no, I don't have that. I don't know what that is. So the visa process is long, it's costly, and people go do it over and over and over again until they get something. What's happening now is that the Mexican passport is kind of being treated as like a less than passport. So when Canada opened visitors, right, that created at least some momentum where people are working in Canada, but they're not staying because they have the ability to come back. So when you actually close entry, you're permitting people like who cross to be like, well, we can't go back until we have documents. So that's the issue with this immigration influx, that there is no ability for people to like, yes, get their lives together. And a lot of people who come to the United States don't want to stay here that long. Like,
yeah, because they're leaving so many people back home.
Right. And so it's funny because a lot of times college students, like when you leave your home, you know, you miss your mom, you miss like even your dog, you like that like douchey neighbor across the street.
Right. You get
like,
homesick
wow.
for the weirdest things.
Yeah. And so people, like, even moving to another state makes you homesick, right? So the same thing happens with people, like, oh, my food's different, people are mean to me, I can't get like enough housing, I'm working 80-hour weeks, you know? And so if there was a better system to allow mobility in and out, I think that one, it would improve livelihood for a lot of these poor undocumented people, but also safety, because they're vulnerable, right? They're vulnerable to being abused at work, abused at their own houses, like housing and all that stuff.
It sounds like it also, and we'll talk about the I don't even have a word to describe how upsetting the families being separated at the borders was, but also that was already happening in a not quite such a harsh, severe way. But you know, if you go, I think, you know, for students in America were like, oh, I can just go home for the weekend, and we still feel so homesick, but they make the decision to go, and you know, you were saying your family did this to go make a better life, and the sacrifices are so immense. And I think a lot of the time when we do talk about people coming to America, we don't realize how much they're sacrificing, and also how hard it's still going to be for them when they get here. It's not like they cross and everything's fine. America has a lot of problems, obviously. So with with this whole process, what are the myths and misconceptions regarding immigrants in this country? And we already kind of talked about the myths of them draining our economy, but what are some other things that you have experienced that a lot of American society kind of assume or just expect? What are some things that you feel like you'd really like to debunk with that?
Yeah, so one of the first things is that the myth that immigrants somehow maintain the minimum wage lower than it should be, right? That is a specific thing that I find really hilarious because who sets wages? Well, yeah, the businesses, it's their incentive, right? I said, keep your wages low so that you can make a profit, right? And so the next myth is really specifically about like social services, right? That immigrants are taking somehow like welfare, that they're sucking different resources that are for natural or naturalized Americans. And that's really interesting because most of the time immigrants don't even go to the doctor when they need to, because they fear that somehow giving this information will lead to a deportation.
Right.
And that was like even before ICE existed, when INS was a thing. So when you have people who rarely go to the doctor, right, or they don't want to bring their kids to different field trips because, will you meet a checkpoint? In California, the checkpoints are a little bit more like harsher, right? But it is a fear, right? You don't think about it. Like the privilege of like going to the zoo. You're like, wow, yeah, that's like a fun trip to the zoo with your elementary school kids. But some kids have to think about it, right? Another myth is that ICE hasn't been on public transportation until now. That's false. When I was a college student in Chicago, I would take Amtrak from Chicago to Albany, New York, and that's where my family's around that area. And so there was a bunch of times where like ICE officials would get on and ask people like, are you an American citizen, right? And at the time I was, right? But that fear never goes away. And so they do ask. And if you didn't look American, quote unquote, they would ask you to step out of the train, right? And it was always interesting who they would ask, right? It was always people of color. It was always someone with an accent. So that particular taking you out has always been a thing. The new thing is adding ICE officials to like DUI checkpoints. That hasn't been a thing before, right? And so specifically, when it comes to crime and immigration, that's the one thing that people are like, well, immigrants bring crime. But we know like so many studies, like it's almost boring how many studies have been done on this that show that immigrants don't contribute. There's no incentive for them to contribute to crime.
Yeah, and that actually leads to my next question. I think a lot of the rhetoric that's used with immigrants, when we pair them with words like illegal and criminals, that psychologically triggers a lot of things because those words are bad. Those are words that understandably do have some fear associated to them. But I think it has really warped how we see immigrants. And so can we talk about those words, how they're used? Because I think obviously there's a huge difference between a college or like, a person on a train going somewhere getting called out about being in this country illegally versus someone that's like, I murdered someone and now I'm on the run. Like that's a bad person. Yeah. And we can, objectively say, oh, that's a criminal. This person did something illegal and should also be punished. Like that system seems very clear. But then when we're pairing it with immigrants, I think that's why there's such a hostility that's being built around the whole conversation. And obviously I understand that there is a legal side to it, but is there anything that you feel about how those words have been used and how that is really constructing how immigrants have to live their life in America, whether they are legal or undocumented, and how that is all affecting the process?
Right. So the process of labeling is very powerful, right? Especially how we know that the media uses these labels because it's easier, right? You only have like 30 seconds to make your point in a preview before a news show. So they're gonna use simple words that really impact and scare, right? And so one of the things that we see from time to time is using the word illegal, or whatever other slur exists, to create a moral panic, right?
Right.
And so we see this as, it's kind of like, it starts with, well, people come in undocumented, right? The kernel of truth, right? They're illegal because they created a crime, so therefore they're labeled as criminals, right? And changing the conversation to making them seem like they've done something terrible makes you less likely to, one, sympathize with them, right? And so we know that that's exactly what happens in the criminal justice system here, where, well, if you label them a criminal, they did that to themselves, right? And again, the people who counter the separation of families and say it's good because they deserve it, right, shows that, one, the process of dehumanization has worked, right? That they have succeeded in making someone less than they need to be, right? And so when it comes to that dehumanization and disconnect, it creates less likely that people will care, right? And so people have been undocumented, like Mexicans, Irish people, Italian people, anyone who came, and it erases that violence that exists, right? And so we see this specifically when it comes to like legal documents, right? So when Trump's recent executive order to house families together, right? A lot of people were like, okay, good. He did the one thing he was supposed to.
Yeah, so I'm sorry to interrupt, but with that, I think that day I obviously was happy that happened, but there was also, and that's just that, there's no but. And there's another part of me that kind of felt like, okay, but this isn't fixing the big problem, and also this still happened. This should never have happened, and this doesn't erase it happening, and we still have to fix this, and we still have to talk about it, because it's not like, oh, boom, these families are back together and all the psychological damage that was done is undone because we signed this document. So with that, like, how do they even how do the families find each other after all that?
The process is right now being run specifically by nonprofits, because there is no incentive really for the government to reunify, right? Also, like I said, ICE doesn't necessarily follow their own rules, right? They have a lot of rules, and it starts like when you read the rules, because I have no life and I just read all of them.
I need to read them too.
They promise like, oh, when intake, we'll give you a whole full medical examination. We'll ask you like what medications you need. If you're diabetic, we'll keep that on file so that you need your insulin at certain times. If you have heart conditions, you can get your meds. And so they always frame it like, oh, we're doing this great service, but then you find out, well, they don't really hire doctors at the same rate that they hire nurses, because nurses cost less than a doctor. Right. And so this process really shows that there's different ways around it, right? And so reunifying is really being done by volunteers, people who've been protesting. And so the Vera Institute is specifically studying people right now in detention to give them access to free or affordable legal service, right? Because we know that separating families doesn't necessarily solve our issues. also people who are in the process of deportation have more incentive to stay in the country. I think it's like over 90% of people who were like processed and outside of the facilities will show up to court the next day, because again, you want to stay in this country, therefore you're gonna try everything in your power to remain here. So separating families, I think that was just a tactic to deter people from coming. And we know in the Obama administration, when they had the influx of unaccompanied what is it called?
Unaccompanied children?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
They necessarily, they came alone, but again, that shows you that they're traveling from El Salvador or Guatemala through Mexico. Some of them don't even make it. Like, we don't even talk about how many deaths of children have occurred from traveling from their home country through Mexico to the border, right? And so having jails, because that's what they are, we just call it detention, again, shows that we don't care, right? That if we can do this to your kids, we can definitely do this to you as a human adult.
Yeah, and that just shows like how far that dehumanization you were talking about has gone when it starts to affect children. Obviously it's horrible when it affects anyone, and by no means do I want to belittle that at all, but I think philosophically, like, there's rules that children and innocent are off limits to some of these more complicated violences that we afflict upon each other. And then to see that it was always a problem, but to see it so blatantly disregarded and accepted, I think was what was so horrific about it, because obviously these things have always been happening. We shouldn't pretend like they haven't. I think that's a lot of the problem, is that if you don't see it, it's really easy, out of sight, out of mind. And some people genuinely don't know, but now we know. And what do we do now?
And so the process of dehumanization is that you can't see your family members, yourself, within those groups, right? And we see this basically in every human rights violation. Like, the people who are violating human rights, they don't see them as people who are part of their family, right? And the people who don't necessarily know people who are undocumented, or they think that they do know someone, right? You don't know necessarily the whole story, right? And so a lot of this is just narratives that are kind of being suppressed, right? And we say, oh, well, we don't necessarily need to focus on immigration because, again, illegal, criminal, whatever, we should be focusing on veterans, or we should be focusing on different things that are more present, right? But there are different conversations, right? We can't just say, oh, well, the kids are suffering, but that's not really something that affects me personally, so I'm not going to care. And so a lot of it comes from just donating money and writing to your senators, and I write a lot, and so they're probably bored with me right now.
No, I think that's very important. I think also with talking about and this isn't really my expertise, and also you studied sociology. This is more for linguists, I guess, and historians, but we tend to forget that we are all immigrants. We were all immigrants at some point. Everyone in this country has come from an immigrant in one way or another, whether, me, obviously very British and Irish, and, eventually, like, if my aunt or something does one of those like family tree things, they're gonna like find, when we were back in a different country. So I think a lot of the time we try to build this disconnect of what is American and what is not, and what this country is and what it isn't. And I think for me, there's been a huge disillusionment just coming into adulthood and finally understanding politics at such a prevalent age of social media where things are not quite as hidden as they always can be. And we're talking about things in a way I haven't seen before in my lifetime, where we're finally starting to see the repercussions of denying a lot of the underlining racism and hostility in America, and how that profoundly affects other people. So I think with that, with the current goings on with the modern problems, it feels really hopeless sometimes. And when it was all going on, I kind of just wanted to lay in bed. I didn't want to check the news. I didn't want to do it, anything, because I was like, I can't drive to McAllen and help. I could write to my senator, but sometimes it feels like, what is that going to do? So with that, like, how you said you write letters to Congress. What would you say, like, what are the things you also recommend doing in those moments where things feel so hopeless? And kind of also what you're saying, like, sometimes we're like, oh, we should be focusing on this, or we should be focusing on that. You can focus on both things. It's not either or. We can do both. But what are some things you do to help fight through that?
Yeah, so I mean, my work is very depressing. It's death in detention centers. It's like, specific violations that exist. So sometimes it is hard, right? And so what I do is basically stay informed. I look through the news to figure out stories that aren't really being told. So we know about the kids on the border, right? We know a lot of the stuff that's happening in California, and we know a lot of stuff that's happening in Texas. But we don't really know immigration beyond those 2 points, right? And so a thing that I've just noticed is just like finding out what's happening. And so there was a raid in Tennessee in a meatpacking facility, and so they were hiring a lot of undocumented people because, again, cheap labor that you don't necessarily have to regulate. When you work overtime, right, you get time and a half, but they didn't do that, right? They actually found that the owner of the facility was in violation of a lot of stuff, not just undocumented, right? He had unhealthy working conditions. But that raid led to arrests, but it also led to, I think, over 400 kids not going to school the next day.
Oh, wow.
In that one county in Tennessee. And so when we find that out, we know that deportation, yes, exists by separating, but it's also something that is a structural violence, right, against people who are living in these places, right? So that disruption wasn't just one day. It's now going to have effects until the next month, right? Because people are going to say, well, if my kid goes to school, or am I next, right? If you're giving a ride to someone and you have a residency and they're undocumented, you can actually get stopped for human trafficking in certain parts.
Really?
So
I did not know that.
Yeah. So that idea of I'm a person who is, driving someone, right? Are my potential vulnerabilities at stake here too, right? So a lot of times we thought, okay, undocumented, once you have a residency, those problems go away. But we're seeing that that's not necessarily true either. The protests that happened on June 30th, I think, was just the beginning of people just voicing their complete discontent with what's happening. And a lot of people feel the way that you do, right? So when I went to the protest on the 30th, I went to that protest in actually College Station, Texas.
Oh, really? Okay.
Right. And so I don't know if you know about Aggie land specifically.
Oh, both of my parents went there, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's conservative, right?
Yes,
but
it is.
Bryan, the next town over, is populated with a lot of people of color, both of Latin American origin and Black people as well. right? And so they protested in front of, I think it was a representative something, I don't remember. But we were standing like in the blazing hot sun with signs as people were driving, right? And so some people were like, yay, beep for approval, and you felt good about yourself. But it was really interesting to see the ones who were completely not happy to see us with signs, right? And so there was a guy who actually stopped right in front of our demonstration, like a busy street. We're like, what are you doing? There's cars behind you. But he just wanted to say, well, I don't agree with what you're doing, protesting. And, well, the kids come here, but how do they come here? And he just wanted us as a group to say that they come here illegally.
Yeah,
that was like
word.
his gotcha moment. And I was like, I don't feel like conversing with you. So there's people you're not gonna get through, right? Because they refuse to see it as something that dehumanizes people,
right?
And they refuse to see it as a legitimate,
systematical,
a structural and systematical impact of violence, because it is violent, right?
Right.
We don't think about violence, we just think about it as like assault, right? But things like that destroy your whole life is violence, right? And so the impact of being detained is just not just physical, but it's also psychological, right? So the effects of these kids psychologically is going to impact them throughout their whole life of like not wondering, some of these kids are like young infants, right? And for women who have kids, right, we know that babies, like, they're clingy because you're the safe person, right?
Yeah, there's been infinite studies done on how crucial the fundamental bonding at the beginning of life is with, especially with your mom. And a lot of the time there's I'm sure people listening know about this. I'm sure you know about this, but a lot of the time you can kind of trace even someone that has a lot of mental illness, or even, God forbid, is a very violent person as an adult, back to how they were never held as a baby and they never got human contact. They never had that bonding. And by no means am I trying to say that, all these people are going to turn out to be horrible at all, but we have to look at the long-term effects of this, and the fact that this doesn't just end, as you're kind of saying, this doesn't just end like as soon as they walk out of that detainment center. This is going to go on forever because they don't understand. And something I think you mentioned earlier, they asked you, if you had AIDS, and you didn't even know what that is. So with a lot of the questions that are being asked and the way things are being explained in the process to people in these situations, it sounds like a lot of the time they're not even trying to make it where you can understand, and in a way that's kind of continuing that dehumanization, because I think a lot of the time it makes perfect sense why they don't understand. Like, why would you? I didn't know what AIDS was when I was 7. And there also is a language barrier, and I don't speak any other language besides English, and I wish I did. And I know a lot of people that are bilingual, but I also know a lot of people that also don't speak other languages. It's just not as common. So a lot of the time I think that goes towards that dehumanization of like, oh, you're dumb, we don't need to explain this to you. So do you feel like that's true, that a lot of the time it's not even explained, like in these detainment centers, they don't take the time to even.
So again, like I said, usually the process means like you do intake, and so it's also significant to say that detainees are not criminals, actually. In the defined like ICE contracts, they actually are just administrative detainees, specifically out of the process of being deported out of the country, right? So they actually guarantee the safe removal of people. That's like one of their things. Like if someone dies, they have to do the investigation because that specific thing in their contract is legally binding, right? And so in these facilities, again, they have a contract with the United States, specifically the Department of Justice and Homeland Security, to basically, one, test to see if you have any diseases, and that's again, to make sure that if you do have an illness, that you're not going to like contaminate someone. And that specifically is to figure out like, you know, who is sick and who needs medication. Because again, if you need heart medication and you don't get it, you're going to die, right?
Yeah.
People have actually died of things that could have been preventable. There was a person who died, I think, in Texas in one of the border facilities of rabies. You're like, how did someone not catch someone? Rabies, right? And then there's times where in California, there's a facility in Adelanto that's like west of Los Angeles, and it's one of the biggest detention centers in California. I think there's about 10, and there's about like 20 in Texas, because Texas has the biggest border specifically to Mexico, and they're actually building a new one. So there's going to be even more. But they had a detainee who was suffering from stomach pains. So he goes and gets checked. They give him Advil. And so he's like, okay, 2 hours later, I'm still in massive pain. Again, they're only giving him Advil. He files a grievance, right? Which means that basically it's kind of like customer service equivalent of like
Complaint.
so-and-so did this, right? And so he just writes this really heartful letter saying like, hey, no one's listening to me. I'm in pain, all of this stuff. And then he writes another one saying like, they don't care. They're liars if they say that I'm fine. He ends up dying of multi-organ failure for a preventable disease, right? And so that was the first death. And after his death, they found that it was the facility's fault for his death, right? They only demoted the medical person, the medical manager. So he used to be the manager, and I think they just demoted him to like assistant manager, and they never hired.
Still works.
Yeah, they never hired a new person, right? And then another death happens. Same thing, basically preventable disease, right? And that was in 2012. So this isn't like early 80s, early 90s. No, this is like recent. So all that specifically shows that these detention facilities don't operate the way that they should. They're actually very deadly. And so kids, right, who usually you don't really like, sometimes they can't verbalize what hurts, right? That anxiety creates a lot of stress on the heart, right? We actually know that the stress of like life, right, racism, all that stuff, actually negatively impacts African Americans more, right? And so we know that Black males live like the least compared to their counterparts, right. And that's again a complete like, you know, result of that structural racism over time, right?
Right.
And
like
so
the adverse childhood experiences, where like the more adverse experiences you have, the more problems, both physical and mental, you'll have later on in life. And all of a sudden these kids that already probably had pretty high scores went up a lot higher.
Right.
And there's so many studies that prove that's
and so again it goes back to our conversation about that dehumanization, right? So even like most of us don't have like bilingual abilities, right? But we did have access to in certain states, right, like languages, right? And so what did everyone want to take? Right, they wanted to take German or French, right? And Spanish, people took it, but they're like, oh, it's an easy class, right? Yeah. Because we don't think the use of Spanish as something that's like prestigious. We think of it as the spoken language of people from Mexico, right? People who are below us. So even that process even starts with just language, and how people start to get upset, right? That, you know, you're speaking your home language.
Yeah, have friends, and I won't use their name, but I have a friend specifically who told me this really, this just very disheartening story where she is bilingual, which I think is so cool. And she works someplace where there's a lot of Spanish speaking people. And so she uses her Spanish. And then one day she was using her Spanish the whole day. And then a English speaking person came up to her, and she just said, "Hola, ¿cómo está?" And then the woman like started yelling at her and just started using slurs and was like, "Don't use that language with me." And she was like, I think she like was like, I don't remember. She had a really good comeback, actually. Mm-hmm. And I always wish that I was as quick-witted as her. But just like the systematical aggression that just is like that. And I think that that's such a really good way to illustrate like we held all of these other languages so high above Spanish, and that really just kind of that is the embodiment of how we kind of think of all these different immigrants in this country, because we do have, we have immigrants from everywhere, not just from the southern border. But so much of the way we think of those people is that we're never questioning if they're adding to our economy. We're never questioning how intelligent they are, if they're criminals. Like every place has criminals. Yeah. You're always going to deal with that. There are already criminals in this country. And so having that whole conversation really just, I think, shows how horrifying and how embedded that thought process is in individuals and in our society.
Right. And so, again, if you are less likely to care about these things, then you won't really be in tune with what the injustices are, right? Mm-hmm. And so we deal with our problems in this country just by confinement, right? Mm-hmm. That's how we think we solve these issues. Mm-hmm. And we know that mass incarceration does not work, right?
Right.
Our crime rate stays the same, and the only reason that it's slowly going down is because like the people who were arrested in the 80s are now getting out currently, right? But the case I wanted to mention that I found really interesting, so a lot of people think that if you have documents that you have nothing to worry about, right? So in Seattle, the Tacoma processing center, so it's like a detention center, already was under investigation for a lot of, let's just say, problems, because there are just a lot of them. They in that time they found a young family. The dad was being deported, right? He was undocumented, but the son was a DACA recipient. He had all his documents in order, and so as the ICE official was deporting his dad, which is already very devastating to see your parent in that way, he was actually taken as well. So he's like, I'm a DACA recipient, and ICE ripped it, threw it in his face, and arrested him too. And they supposedly did that because they said that the young man was gang affiliated, right? And so by putting, again, brown people, black people's faces with gang violence, criminality, that makes it easier to make the case, well, they deserve it because they're contributing to the crimes that we see in this country, right? And so that process really showed that right now, as we see it, ICE is just about getting the numbers up of deportation, right, to satisfy their own pressures. And currently we see that there is push to remove due process, right?
Yeah, that was one of the questions I had. What does that do?
Right. So like I said, I've looked at facilities from the early 2000s to 2012, 2013. And so they're already deficient when it comes to legal aid, right? And so some of the detainees have access to a law library, right? If I had access to a law library, I would not know where to start, right?
Okay.
Thank you for giving me a library, right?
Yeah.
And the worst part is some of them are not even translated into their their native language, right?
I can hardly understand a law book, and I've lived here my entire life, and I still would be beside myself with frustration.
Right. And so they have a software, I think it's NEX US or something, and it basically helps you look up legal aid or something, and some of them don't even have that software or computers available to them.
Right, of course.
And so getting rid of due process, one, demonstrates that, oh, you just come here for the intention to, suck up resources, right? We're actually removing the ability to say, hey, I'm a refugee, or I'm running from something.
Right, which being a refugee and seeking safety is not illegal.
Right. And so we're actually criminalizing that specifically for everyone, not just people from South Central America, but everywhere. And so removing legal help or the process really shows that it's all about removal, right? We see that process is really just about making sure that it's a specific type of immigrant who comes in. So even though Central and South Americans don't make up the majority of people who are undocumented in this country, they make up 90% of the people who are detained, right? And a lot of those people are men, right? So again, we're seeing it being racialized. A lot of people don't want to talk about that, but it is a racial issue, right? Then we see specifically that people want to help these people, right? And again, the Vera Institute has devoted a lot of resources to make sure that they study specifically how legal help can help your immigration case, right? So getting legal help, right, getting a lawyer when you're being deported is actually a catch-22 almost, because you're being processed out, right? So you get a lawyer, it'll help you maybe improve your chances of staying, but it also keeps you in detention longer, right? So one of my uncles who was being deported last March, he actually asked for legal aid, and he was in deportation in a deportation facility in New York for about 7 months. He lost about 20 pounds, was not looking right, and we were a little bit worried about him, right? And so in his case, the lawyer was not able to help his case out, right? But we know that the way that the immigration laws work before and after Trump and before Obama and previously just aren't necessarily speaking to how to one, help the community, but also help, like, again, getting rid of people in small towns who work, right? That's gonna like negatively impact those economies, right? Even cities are going to feel it, right? So a lot of people don't realize that they depend on the labor, right? And even like I think 2 years ago was like the protests of the Day Without Immigrants. And so a lot of the critiques from the Latino community was that they're actually hurting their own selves because, one, you can get fired, right? Two, you stop working, but the businesses that are owned by Latinos with documents are also hurt in the end, right? So they're trying to figure out a way to kind of send the message. And again, it's hard because a lot of them complain that there's no like unified message and there's not a unified leader, right? But we'll definitely see changes with the new Mexican president. So we know that Vicente Fox was very colorful with Trump, and he was before Peña Nieto. And so Peña Nieto comes from more of a conservative economic party, that they're more about privatizing Mexico. So a lot of people died during Peña Nieto's 6 years in office. So unlike in the United States where it's like 4 years and you can renew for another 4, in Mexico you only serve 6 and that's it. So in those 6 years, gas went up, right? So we see an influx. So whatever is happening in those countries are also negatively impacted. And a lot of things we forget as an American community is that America has also played a role in a lot of the elections in South and Central America, right? We helped certain people who didn't really deserve to go in power for the purposes of ensuring our interests, right? Yeah. Which again, that's just how a lot of countries work. But we can't just say, oh, this problem's happening and now they're flooding here and we had nothing to do with it.
Right. Yeah, but it doesn't feel like you should have to specify that, but here we are. So now with detainment centers, you said your uncle was one in New York. How, when you are in a detainment center like that, what are the rules? Do you get to see family? Do you get to leave?
So one, they have to process you, and so they put your name in. Sometimes they get your name wrong, which is very terrible, because if you're trying to look them up and then you don't get the name right, you can't figure out where they are, right? Again, that's another deficiency. So they're supposed to classify you. So an administrative detainee has done nothing. But because of the new changes of priority, people who got like DUIs like 10 years ago have already served, right? They're community service, whatever. People make mistakes, right? Let's not pretend that like only people of color get DUIs. There's so many, right?
Right.
So it prevents people from moving on from mistakes, right? And in his case, he was detained, but they separated the men and women. So sometimes they do that. Sometimes facilities don't do that. They're supposed to separate by classification. There's multiple facilities throughout the country that don't separate, right? There's things called family centers, but those are not like the faces of what's happening. In Arizona, they were actually, so sometimes the government makes a deal with like a local jail, right? And they have like, they call it like an ICE facility, but it's really a local jail that's being used. So people who've been arrested in the community and people who are being deported are being mixed in, right? So they have a mixture of population, which again is another facility. We're not actually ensuring the safety in that process. And then again, illnesses, the stress of it all. If you, again, you do have the right to complain, right? To file a grievance, but when ODO, so the Office of Detention Oversight, is who's responsible for all of these deficiencies. Like they're supposed to review periodically these detention centers and say, okay, so-and-so does do this and this. They go in and they look at which standards are met. When they're not met, they just say, oh, they need to do better, and they give some recommendations. They do interview both the staff and detainees, but selected ones. So in the selected ones, they'll ask them like, what's life like? Are you treated well? A lot of detainees report being verbally abused, right? So frequent like verbal slurs, being called a wetback and so on, right? And again, like that continuous stress of being treated badly. They're not supposed to restrain you, right? So say a detainee is having a stressful moment, because again, anybody who's in a small contained space will lose it. Like that is a thing, right? They'll actually restrain with like in a chair. So they call a restraint chair with like straps everywhere. And again, that's crazy because they're not criminals, they're administrative detainees. They'll call it, so if they have too many like criminal detainees, people who have actually committed crimes, if they have less administrative detainees, they'll actually throw the administrative detainees in solitary, which again, you're not supposed to do. And so all of these just show like a periodic abuse of power, right? And when the detainees complain, they'll say, okay, these were the complaints, but don't take them seriously because they're self-serving opportunists. Like that is the actual quote in about 23 different audits done through, I think, the Southwest. Like, yeah, they complain, but don't take it seriously. Like, oh, medical care doesn't feel good. I can't. The food is bad, right? So we usually think, oh, like people who complain about food are probably exaggerating. But there's one facility that actually took a picture of the food, and it was horrendous. Like it was like a piece of toast and maybe what looked like scrambled eggs. I can't tell you what it was, but you're kind of like, okay, like these are legitimate claims. They have the data shows like that they are being mistreated, but the government says don't listen to them. They don't actually represent what's going on in these facilities. In facilities with high turnover rates, specifically in California, there is a lot of turnover rates for like people who are like COs, like the equivalent of a CO, a correctional officer. But again, they're not called that, but a lot
That's
of
what
them,
they are.
Yeah. They complain that, the detainees, they talk back to me. They want to treat them like they are like in a jail, like in a penitentiary, and that's not how they should, right? And so there's actually a high turnover rate because they're using force that they're not supposed to be using. So one of the detainees was having, I guess, like an emotional episode. That's what the contract said, the audit said. And they took him in, they used force, and the only thing that the oversight office found deficient in that case of excessive force was that when they started beating the detainee, they turned the camera over. And then after they were done, they turned it back. And so it wasn't like, oh, you beat someone up, that's the issue. No, you turned the camera the wrong way.
So you're aware that this is wrong.
Yes, right. So that, again, they know that they've made mistakes, right? And that was, I think, in 2010.
Wow.
We can only assume what's happening now because the biggest industry right now is like border correction, right? And so, yeah, the fact that the oversight office will say, oh, you turned the camera or you didn't show your face before you beat someone up. Like, that's what we find
That's
wrong.
what's problematic.
Yeah. Shows, again, that process of they're less than people who deserve respect and dignity. And that's what the deportation process at heart should be, a process that doesn't strip someone of their human rights, but also their dignity, their respect.
Right. And with the, I think that there's been a lot of news coverage over the detainment centers in McAllen, Texas. But how much do you know about those detainment centers that were being used to hold tender age children?
Right. So again, tender age specifically usually defined as below 5, 7, depending on your definition. The facilities themselves are, again, secretive in the sense they don't really want people to know what's happening, right? So if you listen to senators and representatives who have gone down there to like ask, they can't tell you anything because they themselves have been turned around, right? And so they specifically, again, deportation in this country has always been kind of behind the scenes. We don't actually know what's going on because they don't want us to know what's going on. The data that I had to be received kind of through a lawsuit from the National Immigration Justice Center. They literally had to sue them in order to get the freedom of information, right? Because everybody can have a freedom of information if you work like for the government, that they're supposed to give you that information. They'll give it to you sometimes, but they'll redact everything. So if I were to give you this piece of paper and we're like, oh, here's this paper and it's just in black, then it's not useful, right? So what's happening in McAllen just shows that, again, it's almost working as like a daily operations of like, this is just what we do. We deport, but we're not really going to tell you how we do it. We're not going to tell you the conditions. We're not going to tell you exactly how many kids are in here because they won't really tell us the numbers. Right. And if you do file a Freedom of Information Act for those facilities in McAllen, it will take maybe 2, 5, 7 years to get, because again, they don't necessarily want you to have that information right now. And again, a lot of it has to do with, one, again, protecting the interests of the facility and privacy reasons. But again, it's a federal, state-run facility. They have to give you that information. But what we know is that the kids have to go through the court process alone.
I saw a video on that, and I was watching it, and I was like, I don't even feel like this is real. Like there's no common sense to that at all. There's nothing about that makes sense to me. No,
Right.
like I know I need to be objective, but like that doesn't make any
Right.
logical sense.
Right. Like, I remember being confused when translating for my uncle who got a speeding ticket. Like, I can only imagine being like that young, right, and being in that room with people I don't know, right? So it shows that it's not true due process, because they're not at the age of consenting, right? They're away, their parents are being stripped of their parental rights, right? And so that just shows that the process is being really warped, right? And so in times of crisis, right, or perceived moral panic, as this is, because there was no real like immigration crisis,
right? Yeah,
this was just based on the priorities, and also just showing coverage, right? Again, makes people think that it's just an influx, that people are just coming in and coming in, right? But that's not really the case. And actually, Mexican officials have actually started to run on the promise that that people in Mexico don't need to go to the U.S. anymore, like that they're going to change the government, but we'll see if that's a true thing.
right.
So McAllen really shows you that that anything is possible when it comes to deportation policy, right? That we will go as far as putting kids in facilities without them knowing where their parents are. There was a case where a mother actually sued in order to get her child back, right? And again, money. And that process, her lawyer was able to successfully unify. But again, the system sucks so much that, again, just a name that's wrong, an age that's wrong, you won't be able to find them, right? A year ago, my mom works for a Catholic church, volunteers, not really works, but she works with a lot of people who are undocumented, and they basically were like talking about how they specifically couldn't find someone at the border. And so they spelled the name wrong. And so we weren't able to locate him for 3 days until he called his family members. And again, it was like a letter that was wrong, right? Because if you go to the ICE website right now and you know someone who's detained, if you type in their name and their date of birth, you should be able to locate them if all their documents are right? But if they're wrong, then that creates a kind of gray area. Where are they? So it really, I think the push should be for research-based policies, which we don't have in this country, right? Some people are starting to push for it, but it's not something that we really see within, like, even our politicians, like Democratic and Republican at large, right? So I think as we go into the future, when we make our voting decisions, we should make it based on, like, are the policies that they're presenting, again, bipartisan, just are they research based, right? Is that research actually valid, right? And is that research actually telling us something that we need to do better or change completely, right? Because keeping families together, that movement is again run specifically by people who are dedicated to these injustices, right? There's actually a push for people who are bilingual to sign up. I don't remember. It's specifically for bilingual Chicana women that you can sign up and be a translator. So again, even the littlest things like that, like if you can just donate, like, a day to that already tremendously helps, right? Translating, even at your local, like, place, if they need something, translation is like the number one thing that people are looking for right now, either like word or written documents.
So along with that, what are the other organizations people should volunteer for and be giving their money to, and all that?
So the well-known one is Raíces.
Right.
And so, again, they've been doing this for a while now. But organization, small or large, even in the local. I know that in College Station, there's like more mobilization within the local community to like combat like raids specifically. So again, look to your local organizers, right? Because again, immigration detention is not just like a specifically like wide nation thing. It's like it's a local issue, right? So that specific town that was impacted in Tennessee, like that was like a thing that they're going to have to deal with. That's going to impact their local economy, their whole education, all that. So look to the organizers. They usually, like, the Spanish speaking churches are the ones who are the most active. And again, if you're shy, like, they need to see who their allies are, right? And so that was one of the things during the protests that I got to see with my own eyes. Like, the immigrant community looked shocked that, like, people were there for them. Specifically because, again, usually we think the conservative towns, there's no hope, but people are compassionate, right? And again, it doesn't matter what political party you're in. If you care about it, you can still have a conversation, right? And I think people need to look beyond like those specific lines and be like, okay, we need to just help right now, because they're going to continue these harsher policies and things are going to get more chaotic within like these detention centers and also within like the raids and the threat of raids, right? So again, just donating your time locally, even to just translate or help someone or, you know, figure out what's going on or how you can help is a huge start.
Awesome. Now, where do you suggest you get unbiased information? Because I completely agree. I think we really do need to look at more research-based findings. A lot of the time, I feel very skeptical about like anything that I learn, whether it's about this crisis or anything else going on. In the information age, a lot of the time I'm like, I don't even know if this is real. I don't know where these people are getting this information from, because everything can be altered through editing. So where are some places you would recommend people deep dive into that research and get valid information?
Right. So it's really hard, specifically just if you get your information like on Twitter, it's really difficult. Right.
Yeah.
And a lot of people get their news from social media. Right. We definitely know this. So because we are specifically talking to a larger student body here at Texas State, right? You guys actually have like access to researchers, right? So again, reading raw material, so like that means like raw data. So if they reference something in the news that you're like, okay, cool, but I want to read it for myself, right? So that's kind of what I did with the EO, the executive order, when Trump was like, okay, we're going to unify the families again. I read it specifically to figure out, okay, what does it actually say? And so then I was like, okay, yes, unification, but it also says like criminalization, and also you may be detained for longer periods of time, right? So it changed a little bit more of the conversation. No one had to tell me that. I read it myself. Then you can look at specifically if you are a college student, looking at, again, the data, the research that has been kind of done already. The Vera Institute, again, publishes a lot of stuff. Like they give you the data, right? You don't have to like read their reports. They don't have any affiliations with any political parties. Again, different research institutions exist, right, that are not like university affiliated. Sometimes people think, oh, well, universities have really liberal or conservative professors and therefore they can't give me non-biased information. I think that sometimes that's true, but I also think that a lot of professors don't really care about the like party lines. They care about more of the like information, the truth, right? The research, like how can it be explained in a way that's, again, it's not going to look good for any political party at this moment, right? So my suggestion would be to, again, if they reference things, you learn how to cite your sources. So did they. So cite their sources. See if they're like actually telling you what's in the document. If they're just quoting one little section, what is it that they're talking about? And so it's really hard not to like go towards news that's, again, a little bit less problematic.
It's like more digestible.
Yeah, because it's hard. Sometimes you read a headline and you're like, okay, well, today is going to be a crappy day. But then you have to kind of have to read through and see, okay, what it is that they're looking at. And it's very hard for me since 2016 to have conversations with people who believe the opposite of me, right? But I don't think that some people, for their own emotional capacities, need to separate, which totally like, yes, take your emotional labor and take it somewhere else. You don't need to like change anyone's mind. But we definitely need to like talk to people who maybe haven't voted or who are interested and who are thinking about those things. Because again, the research is important, but our actions are even more important.
Yeah. Now, my last question is, because you study sociology, what do you think is important about being a sociologist and studying immigration? What are some of the things that through your career have I don't know if you've had any epiphanies or any moments where you're like, this is why I chose sociology, and why you think that's so important to this, not only this conversation, but also just the work that you do and trying to make the world a better place.
Right. So the moments that I've had, like my aha moment, was definitely when I was working on the immigration facility information, because I had known about deportation. And again, certain immigrants like myself who are now documented, we kind of forget the struggle. Because again, I got citizenship at 18, so I haven't had to think about it for a while, for a long while now. And so you had to, I had to think about things that are kind of in line with our discipline, right? And so when it comes to looking at, even like when we were talking about like the certain uses of words, right? In the documents that I study, like instead of saying death, they say permanent injury beyond medical intervention. And you're like, wow, like I had that moment where I was like, people like actually write ways to like hide the wrongdoing, right? How do you like accidentally kill someone and say, well, it was their fault that they asked for Advil instead of harder pain medication, right? Or that they didn't complain hard enough, right? So I kind of took my discontent with what I was seeing, what was happening, and again, I'm in a position of privilege now and power to kind of give the information out, talk to people, and so as a sociologist, I use all of the people that you had to take in your one-on-one class. They're like, why will I ever care about Durkheim? Why would I ever care about, Marx is not my favorite, right? But at least I understand him enough to be like, oh, I see why people want to go towards that, because that seems like an option, right? Or when people use religion to excuse certain things, right? You're like, oh, interesting, because this is like a cycle, right? Even the how to create a moral panic, right? If you take a deviance class and you go over like the recipe of how to make a moral panic, you're like, wow, like we really are doing a really good job of baking this moral panic at the moment.
I'm actually taking deviance and immigration studies this semester, and I think that's going to be very enlightening. Did you have anything else to say? I'm sorry I interrupted.
No worries. So basically, as a sociologist, it's not just about one discipline, it's about multiple disciplines. So you have to understand the history, right? You also have to talk about, how we change the conversation in this country a lot, right? And so I think it has to really start when you're an undergrad thinking about, okay, these injustices, and when you leave, if you're not doing any better, you didn't really like grow as a person, right? And so I think that using all those things that you learn, even if you're not going to go to grad school after college, I always tell like students, like, you know, you're going to live next to people, you're going to live in communities, you're going to contribute to the economy. And if you are still a terrible person after like not using, not just in my class, but all of the scholarship that you have access to, is still significant. We still do sociology even if we don't think we're doing it.
Right. Yeah, that's one of the things that I think led me to want to do this podcast, and why I am so passionate about sociology is because one of the things about it is that it really does lend itself to so many different conversations and so many different things that we need to improve on. And one of the other things about it is that I think when people hear about it, people will ask me a lot, like, what exactly is sociology? Because I think it's something people hear a lot, but they're not, they're kind of scared to ask because they're like, I should know what this is, but I don't. And a lot of the time, I think what's really been something that I keep on finding a pattern of is it's constantly researching that which is kind of hidden, as you were saying, but it's also kind of feels like it's hidden in plain sight. It's like these things that, whether it's a sentence that you read and some research that you realize has been reworded to excuse a process, it's really deep diving into those things, and it affects all of us. And I think a lot of the time when we talk about immigration or even racism in this country, sometimes I think when people don't really see it, they think it doesn't affect them. And to me, I kind of especially studying sociology, you kind of start to realize how everything is interlaced, and how if you know, have a friend whose like husband is an immigrant and they are being affected by this, and that friend's important to you, by extension it affects you, or you know, and that's just a very vague example of that, but yeah, I think that's a really beautiful way to put.
Yeah, and I think I have a little bit of hope for the future in the sense that I kind of have to. But also, my mom told me a really funny story. She cleans houses in upstate New York. And she has had, like, she has one house that she's worked for since she got here. And, like, I worked with her at one point. Like, so I know this man very well. Okay. And he's very wealthy. His ex-wife, he's had several at this point, but the first one, the original one, she's actually really close with the Trump family. There's actually a picture of them like at dinner or something at her house. And so after Trump won, my mom is kind of shady, and she would just put the picture frame down on the floor so he would know, like, I don't like this. But he's kind of used to my mom's humor at this point. But they had a conversation about immigration. And that was like the first time my mom's like, okay, he's never asked me. And he's known that she was undocumented at one point, that she has kids who are in college, who have finished college. And so he was like asking, and then he's like, I just didn't know. I just thought people come here with no money. And she's like, they come here with like debt, threats, like everything. Like they come here the same reason your forefathers came here, the reason that they stayed here, right? And so he was kind of like a little bit, like he likes to argue because he's a very hardcore Republican. But she said that she heard him talking to his family on the phone about what she had just said. And so she's like, if that old white man can like definitely talk to his family about this stuff, they don't know, right? A lot of people don't know. So she's like, I'm just starting to have conversations with people who actually ask me, right? And so that was kind of one moment that I was like, okay, like he really is a little bit problematic, but he had his moment of like, okay, maybe I need to reevaluate what I believe and think, right? Now that I have this information, and that's how it kind of starts. I'm not saying that every person of color has to start having like the, you know, come to Jesus moment with me, but it definitely, it helps to talk, right? And you're don't go into a conversation thinking that you're going to change their mind, but definitely just give them the information.
Just educate, try to enlighten each other, because a lot of the time, it's just, people don't know. And a lot of time, I'll talk to someone, and much like this conversation, they give me a lot of information that I just didn't know before.
Right. And again, ignorance is fine, but once you have that information and you choose to remain ignorant, that's on you.
Yeah. Well, I think that story is a great way to end this interview. So I want to thank you so much again.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I can't thank you enough. I feel that you've been insightful and also encouraging. And thank you again for being on the podcast today.
Thank you.